Okay. Oh, good evening, everybody, and welcome if this is your first time joining for week 3 of our MCIC series. Tonight's session is entitled Men and Mental Health. We do have some community standards during the MCIC conference. Kaden is going to link a full version of this in the chat. However, I would like to share a few things before we move forward. Please obtain consent before taking any photos, screenshots, copying text, or sharing content that is not your own. Please mute your microphone when you are not speaking. When you are speaking, please try to turn your camera on and identify yourself. Speak clearly and slowly so that our live closed captioning service is as accurate as possible. We are using live closed captioning throughout all of the MCIC sessions. In order to enable this on your end, please look at your Zoom taskbar and click the CC button. This may be under the More button as well, and click View Live Transcript. Please message us in the Zoom chat if you're having any difficulties with this. The QR code on your screen links to our Campus Climate YouTube page, where we have posted all of the recordings that we have so far for the sessions this month. We are recording most of the sessions to make them as accessible as possible for those who cannot attend live. The recording links are posted in Whova as well as on our Campus Climate YouTube page, where they will ultimately live after the conference is finished. If you have questions at any point tonight, please message us either publicly or privately using the Zoom chat. I've listed the names of some of your hosts and co-hosts that are here tonight. We will also be monitoring our Campus Climate email account throughout tonight's session and throughout the entire conference. And lastly, I would like to introduce tonight's session, entitled Men and Mental Health, hosted tonight by Alec Eshelman. People of all genders face unique barriers while experiencing mental health challenges. There is evidence that gender stereotyping may lead to underdiagnoses of mental health issues in men. Additionally, men are less likely to seek help when experiencing mental health challenges. This discussion aims to increase participants' awareness of these issues and to identify ways men with mental health challenges can experience and provide more support and material assistance. I will now turn things over to Alec.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your lives and schedules to be here tonight. I really do appreciate it. I know some of you, I'm looking through the names, and a lot of you I don't know. So I'll briefly introduce myself and then we'll kind of jump into it. I also ask if you're able to, if you wouldn't mind turning on your videos, I would appreciate it. I get really bad vibes of like March 2020 when I'm talking to a bunch of black squares of the pivot to online teaching. So if you're able to, I would appreciate that. And I also understand if for various reasons you might not be able to turn on your camera, that is fine also. My name is Alec Eshelman. I'm an assistant professor in psychology at UW-Platteville. I'm also a licensed psychologist and I see clients part-time in a clinic here in Platteville. So what we're going to talk about is certainly important to me professionally and also personally. And I'm looking forward to getting some discussion going. I certainly don't hope that this is just me talking to you the whole time. I really do hope that to the extent that you're able and willing to, you can kind of jump in and share your own thoughts, perspectives, experiences as well. I think that's very valuable. So without further ado, I'm going to share a few things with you here. Let me get my screen share going here. Oh, wait, that's the wrong thing. One second. All right. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. So the first thing that I actually want to jump in before we dive too much into any of the specific issues, I just want to name a few things. Tonight, we're going to be talking about men and mental health issues, but I want to explicitly state that men aren't the only group that we could be talking about that have their own particular challenges related to mental health, and there are a lot of groups that are underrepresented in access to services and things like that. But we're talking about men tonight, and hopefully there are other opportunities to talk about other groups in general across the board in the United States. Access to mental health care is not what it could be or should be. And so there's a lot of improvements that I think should be made and need to be made. So hopefully conversations like this are a small part of moving toward that. Please feel free to jump in the comments at any point. I'll try to keep track of those. And also, I think Caden is helping me out with that too, which is greatly appreciated. So please don't hesitate to jump in with any questions, comments, observations. I really do want to hear from all of you. And to that end, I want to start out with a little bit of a discussion. And I know Zoom discussions, they have their own challenges. So I'm going to actually ask you to join some breakout groups in a minute, just so that you have smaller groups to discuss some of these things. And then we'll come back as a whole group to see what you discussed and kind of get some information. So before we jump into men and mental health specifically, I thought it would be useful for a few minutes to just discuss mental health broadly. I think mental health is something that is part of our kind of cultural and societal conversation, much more so than it used to be, say, a generation ago. But with that comes a lot of misconceptions, I think, too, and misunderstandings about what it is. So what I'm going to ask you to do in a minute here are discuss these 3 questions in your breakout rooms, which I will assign to you momentarily. So first off, what does it mean to have a mental health issue? What are we even talking about when we're talking about mental health? Where do these ideas come from? There are a lot of different sources that kind of inform our own personal understanding of what mental health means. And so I want to get your thoughts on what those have been for you in your life, and maybe your thoughts more broadly on what some common sources of those ideas are. And then finally, I know that this question assumes something. Why do we treat mental health issues so differently than physical health issues? So of course, that question does assume that there is a difference there. And I think most people would probably agree there is a difference. So I'm going to also put these questions in the chat, because I believe then you'll be able to see them once you're in your breakout rooms. So hopefully that is accurate. So I just put those questions in the chat to you all. And now I'm going to open up some breakout rooms, and I'd ask that you jump into those and discuss these for a few minutes, and then you'll receive an invite to rejoin the main group momentarily. Okay. So you should see something now to join a breakout room. Emily, to your knowledge, will they be able to see those questions that I put in the chat once they're in the breakout room? So hopefully you had enough chance to discuss those questions, at least a little bit. I'm kind of curious what some of your responses were. Maybe first to the first two questions. What does it mean to have a mental health issue, and where do these ideas come from? What were some of the things that you discussed in your groups? And you can either enter those in the chat or unmute yourself and speak freely.
Well, if my group members don't mind, I can say a couple of things. We had a good conversation, and so kind of the what, folks talked about mindfulness and a personal perception of wellness, but also, kind of the antithesis of that when you start to look at mental health disorders or challenges that folks are having, things of that sort. And then related to the second one, how you perceive yourself. And that's, one of our group members really talked about, if you have good mental health, oftentimes you perceive yourself good, right? And if we're having some mental health challenges, maybe we're not perceiving ourselves that good. So good conversation for them.
Yeah, interesting. And so do you mean that you're not perceiving yourself accurately, or that you perceive yourself to be in distress and having some suffering?
I think the latter.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. A lot of really important points that you make. Obviously, the person's individual perception of how they're doing seems like a pretty important thing to consider. And you also mentioned the idea of health, I think, at the beginning of your comment. And I think that's in some ways a little bit hard to actually create some kind of universal definition for what does it mean to be mentally healthy, because there are so many individual differences. What the healthy individual looks like may vary based on culture and values and so many other things. So you can start to get into the weeds pretty quickly when you try to create kind of one size fits all definitions for some of these things. Thank you so much for sharing some of what your group talked about. What were some other things that came up in some of your groups?
I think kind of to go off your comment about not doing a one size fit all. I was talking about how we were talking about the ideas of where mental health comes from, and we all agreed that social media can have a really big impact on what that looks like for different people. And I just kind of told my group that mental health for me was very different, because coming from a community of color, and I can't speak for everybody, but in my culture and the people I was around, it wasn't something that we talked about. You were just supposed to deal with adversities, and what goes on in the house stays in the house type of thing. So we weren't pointed into the right direction to get mental health services. And I never really knew about it until college, these kinds of conversations. So
thank you so much for sharing that and for sharing a little bit of your experience. So it sounds like one of the things you said was depending on the community that you in which you've been raised, your family culture, lots of other different things that can influence your own understanding of what you're going through. And if you don't have a lot of information about what mental health issues can look like, then you might not even really be aware that you're going through one. And I can speak to that myself as well. I think in my late adolescence and early adult life, prior to studying psychology in any kind of professional way, I went through some things that I had no frame of reference for. And only in retrospect do I understand, I think I maybe had depression. I know I can't diagnose myself with that. But at the time I didn't have the language for it. And so I think there's a lot of folks who, depending on where they're coming from, they may not really realize that this is actually really relevant to them. Great. Maybe we can take the third question too, but also if there are any other things from the second one that came up that you want to throw in. But I want to dip our toe into this one a little bit as well. First off, I guess if you don't think that these are treated differently, you can speak to that. But what did your groups talk about when you talked about this, kind of comparing the way that we treat physical health ailments like a broken leg or diabetes to a mental health issue like anxiety or depression?
Our group hadn't really gotten to this question, but I think the biggest difference is that one of them is a lot more easy to notice. If someone has a physical health issue, usually it's a little bit more noticeable, like just physically visibly, whereas mental health concerns can very easily go under the radar and can be hidden a whole lot easier, just from an overall standpoint.
Great. Thank you, Connor, for sharing that. And obviously there are going to be differences depending on what the specific mental health issue is. But I think that's a really great observation that at least for some physical health ailments like a broken leg, it's really kind of black and white. You know, you can see it, there it is. You can take an x-ray, there's the break. With depression, it's so much hazier than that. What is depression? Where is it located? What's it caused by? We can't take a picture of it. You know, maybe we can do some brain imaging and kind of see some evidence that the person is depressed, but the phenomena are quite different from each other. And I think that leads to some real challenges. And as you mentioned too, to some extent, if we're talking about, say, a broken leg, it may be hard to conceal that. You know, you're going to be limping and in obvious pain. With at least some mental health issues, you may actually be able to conceal those really effectively. And even people who are pretty close to you in a lot of ways, they may not really have any inkling that you're going through something and you're suffering. Other things that came up as you discussed that question? Okay, well, maybe we'll move forward a little bit then, just for the sake of time, to make sure that we get through to some other things as well. So there's a lot more, you know, we could talk for hours and hours and hours about what mental health issues are and how they're defined by professionals. I think, you know, one of the takeaways from what we were just talking about, it can be challenging to define them in a really clear and concrete way. And that presents a lot of different challenges. Not just for treatment, but also for kind of understanding if you're going through one of these yourself. But to throw some other information at you, let's see, am I sharing? I want to make sure I'm sharing this with you. Okay, so the next little bit of information here, the next slide, men have mental health issues too. I didn't want to throw a bunch of statistics at you the whole night, but I did think it would be useful to share at least some statistics of relevant, just so we kind of have a sense of the scope of things. So some relevant statistics, about 15% of men, these are all in the US, and to some extent, these would vary internationally based on the particular region. Some disorders are pretty consistent across cultures. Some appear to be more common in other cultures than others. And sometimes these numbers are inaccurate in part because people don't always seek help. And so we can only diagnose who shows up. So some of these may be a little bit underreported, but at least 15% of men will experience major depressive disorder in their lives. This is what we commonly call depression. That's the clinical term for it, is major depressive disorder. 20% of men will experience an anxiety disorder at some point in their lives. 20% of men will develop alcohol dependency. You can kind of see these statistics start to add up. One of the key things that I would want to convey is that this isn't just a few men on the fringes. These things are quite common. And if you know any men at all, any number of men, then you probably know some individuals who've experienced some mental health challenges at some point. maybe currently, or if not in the future. I think that's just so important to understand, because like we were talking about, these things can often be hidden. It can give the impression that they're very, very uncommon and only a few people experience them. And as you're going through it, then you might feel like, wow, what's wrong with me? Am I really the only one who's experiencing this? Very well could be. A lot of people you know are also kind of feeling similar things, but are similarly kind of concealing them. So beyond this, I know this is a pretty heavy topic to bring up, but when it comes to suicide, approximately 4 times as many men die by suicide each year. Women do attempt suicide at higher rates. Men typically select more lethal means, such as firearms, and that kind of explains this statistic. Suicide is one of the top leading causes of death for men, especially young men. But actually the most at-risk group of individuals, and this has been true for quite some time, is old white men from dying by suicide, which kind of surprises some people. And even, some disorders that are considered not really a men's issue, eating disorders are increasing in prevalence in men, due in part to, well, lots of things, but the societal pressure, unfortunately, is kind of going in the wrong direction, and there's increased pressure to kind of look a certain way. So there's lots more statistics that I should share. This is the source that I had for these ones. And again, I don't want to get too, kind of mired in the statistics. I just generally wanted to convey that idea that these things are really quite common. And if you think about, all these different statistics, there are other disorders that I haven't named here. It's more common than not that you will know someone, or you yourself will experience a mental health issue at some point. Does anybody have any questions or comments on this before we move to the next slide? Okay. All right.
Sorry, Alec.
Oh yeah, yes.
Do you have percentages or ideas of how many of these things are comorbid with each other or like overlap?
That's a great question. I couldn't tell you the exact percentages, but very frequently people who meet criteria for one diagnosis will also meet criteria for a second or even a third diagnosis, which is known as comorbidity. So you wouldn't, to get a sense of the overall prevalence of these things, you couldn't just add up these percentages and say, wow, it looks like the majority of men, because two of the most commonly comorbid classes of disorder would be mood disorders like depression and anxiety disorders. And those are, for some anxiety disorders, it's more common than not that you'll also meet criteria for some second disorder. So comorbidity that's a kind of a whole separate thing and tangent, but that is a really good point. And one of the things that we want to better understand is, why is it that when you have one anxiety disorder, it's so common that you will also have a mood disorder? It kind of speaks to the possibility that there might be some common underlying cause for some of these things. And we have some evidence around that, but I probably shouldn't go too far down that tangent, but it's a great point. And I think it kind of speaks to how, for a lot of folks who have mental health issues, it's not like it's, just this one thing. It can be an accumulation of a lot of different things, some depression, some anxiety, maybe some substance use on top of that. And the accumulation of all of those different kinds of suffering can really be a heavy burden to live with. And as we'll talk about soon, a lot of men in particular live with these things in silence and don't reach out for help. And there are some reasons why that might be the case. And hopefully there's some things that can be done about that as well. So the next thing that I kind of wanted to share with the group was a specific example, which I think specific examples can be powerful for, understanding what this can look like. And they can also, I think, help reduce some of the stigma around these things when we see examples of people who are going through different mental health issues. So I wanted to show you, some of you may be familiar with Kevin Love, the NBA player, and some of you may not. He, over the past few years, has become quite an advocate for folks with mental health issues after disclosing his own mental health challenges that he's experienced as a pro athlete. And his example is pretty notable in part because of how rare this tends to be. There are huge risks to someone at that level, but honestly, at any level, disclosing that they have a mental health issue professionally, it might impair your ability to get a contract and things like that, and opens you up to all kinds of hate speech and other things like that. So this is about a 5-minute video. I think we've got time to watch it. And then I've got a question just to kind of stimulate some discussion based off of this as well. So I'm gonna switch my screen that I'm sharing over to the video, and hopefully this works without a hitch. I think I need to also share my sound. Okay.
After 10 years in the NBA, Kevin Love is still at the top of his game. For the past 3 seasons, the 29-year-old 5-time All-Star played side by side with superstar LeBron James. Together, they took the Cleveland Cavaliers to the NBA Finals and won a championship in 2016. But what teammates and fans didn't know was that early last season, while the Cavs were struggling with a string of losses, Love was experiencing problems of his own. Anxiety and depression. It all came to head during a November home game against the Atlanta Hawks. That's when Love, the team's star power forward, had a full-blown panic attack in the team locker room.
I had a moment where I thought I was going to die. I had never experienced something like that. I thought I was having a heart attack.
Heart racing?
Heart racing. And I was running around looking for something that I couldn't find. I just wanted to get air. And so I ended up basically unconscious on the floor and, putting my hand down my throat and trying to get something out of there, but there was nothing there. So it was...
Who found you in that moment?
Our head athletic trainer, Steve Spiro, found me. And I just remember him screaming my name, because you don't really know how to deal with that.
Did your teammates know at the time what had happened to you?
No. They had texted me after the game and had no idea what happened. So I just kind of brushed it off, because in our sport or in life and being a man, you're taught to suppress it. You're taught to, in a lot of ways, suffer in silence.
But Love decided to break his silence and no longer suppress what he was feeling. He shared his personal struggles with mental health in a powerful essay he wrote for the Players Tribune titled, "Everyone is Going Through Something."
I felt not only could I tell my own story, but I'd be able to impact people and maybe, change just that one person's life.
I was one of those people.
I was diagnosed with GAD, general anxiety disorder, and mild panic, very similar to what Kevin Love was talking about there.
Inspired by Kevin's story and hoping to do the same for others, I opened up about my own experience with anxiety disorder right here on Today.
You feel like you're dying. In fact, I went to the hospital, and the first thing you put it on, I got leads on my chest. I'm like, my heart's going to stop, or I'm going to have a heart attack. And of course, what happens is you're perfectly fine. Kevin, since I've shared my story, largely inspired by you, I'm amazed everywhere I go. People are like, hey, the anxiety piece you did on today's show, thank you so much. What's the reaction been for you?
Everywhere I go. It's the same with you. I mean, having the courage to be upfront with this kind of a thing has been unlike anything I've ever experienced.
Why does society think that you're impervious to a mental health issue?
I watched the Robin Williams documentary and how he dealt with mental health issues, and Kate Spade, she felt like it would hurt her brand. And then Anthony Bourdain, who was, seemed to have it all. Bryan Cranston had a great quote. He said, "Success is not immune to depression."
You mentioned Anthony Bourdain, who was a hero to you.
Big hero.
Have you ever felt a sense of fear that your own depression or issue could take you to that dark of a place?
And I think those thoughts and bad thoughts can creep into your head, and your mind can play tricks on you, and that's scary. So I think it's a never-ending process, and I know you don't have all the answers. I certainly don't.
There's a big bucket we talked about, mental health, and we lob a lot of things in there. Anxiety, depression, bipolar, suicide. Well, I'd love to know how you think about all those things being discussed, because I think society just looks at it and goes, you're crazy. Right. That's the word. No one wants to be considered crazy.
Right. From my experience and in talking to other players that have dealt with a number of those things. What's going to happen if people do find out about this? Am I going to get the contract? Am I going to be able to take care of my family? What are people going to think of me?
What can teachers, coaches, leaders in the community do to help young boys in particular?
I think just be able to be at arm's reach for kids and teach them not to suppress it. I mean, for us, it was always keep your chin up, which is fine, but don't suppress your feelings. Don't bury them, because eventually that's going to add up and it's going to surface in one way or another. Like for me, it was rage fits, or it was, going dark for a few weeks and staying in my room after basketball practice and not talking to anybody and not getting much done.
Today, Love manages his anxiety by talking to a therapist and sharing his feelings with those who supported him most, his fellow teammates.
LeBron, I think, said on social media after you wrote that article, he shouted you out and gave you some love. What did that mean to you?
It was a special moment for me because, he shook my hand, looked me in my eye and said, "You helped a lot of people today. It's important." And that was super powerful for me because, his influence and having my back with that was super important to me.
I'm no LeBron, but I got your back too.
Appreciate it, brother.
I'm going to pause it there. But I know some of you may be familiar with Kevin Love's story and some not, but I think that's a great example of somebody using his position to advocate and speak out. And like we talked about with some of those statistics, I mean, this stuff is so common that he's not the only pro athlete or well-known person or just, human going through these things. So I wanted to ask kind of a follow-up related to that then. And if you have any other reactions to that video, please share. But, Kevin Love spoke to some of these things in in that little clip that we saw, some of the barriers that he experienced. But I'm curious to hear some of your thoughts. So what do you think some barriers are that men face to acknowledging their own mental health issues or just discussing these things more generally? What gets in the way or what makes that hard to do?
I mean, one thing that I've noticed is that they don't want to be perceived as weak. You know what I mean? For athletes, that's one thing. I'm someone who wants to go into law enforcement. That's a very similar field where it's, all these macho guys, they don't talk about that kind of stuff. And they're afraid that, it can hurt their prospect of getting a job. If you're afraid and you talk about your feelings, you're a sissy or whatever, whatever words they want to use, you're not man enough to do the job. People are afraid that they're not going to get a job if they say something.
Yeah, Braden, thanks so much for sharing that. And I saw a lot of people nodding. I was one of them. What is the reaction going to be of other people, of other men, but other people more generally as well? Are they going to see me as fill in the blank, right? You use some of the words weak, a sissy. Is it going to affect me professionally? And you mentioned law enforcement. There are probably certain places in society where it's going to be a little more easier to open up. Like for me as a psychologist, I probably have a little more freedom. Hopefully, at least most psychologists are like, yeah, okay, I get it. But there are some who still aren't going to be as open to that. But there are other places in society, probably pro athletics, probably law enforcement, the military, other places where being a certain kind of man is especially kind of heavily emphasized. And what do you do if you're in one of those environments and also you are experiencing some different challenges? So that's it. Yeah, such an excellent point. Thank you for sharing that. Other people have other thoughts or reactions?
I think a big barrier is that even though, like, we all know, or at least a lot of people understand that it is an issue, but if no one else is coming forward with it, clearly it's not an issue for them, right? Like, they may be dealing with it, but they figured out a way to deal with it. So the fact that I have to talk to someone makes me less of a person than them. It makes me less powerful, or and I'm not as good at this as they are. So maybe I should just figure a way to. And then just because the status quo, everyone stays silent, that encourages more people to stay silent on this issue.
That's really interesting. You're kind of describing almost like a catch-22 where, okay, so we have these statistics, we have some information that this is not all that uncommon, but if the status quo is that nobody's talking about it, how do we escape from that place and start to have a more open dialogue and understand how common it is? It's hard to be that first person in your particular circle to open up. And I think people like Kevin Love are in some ways maybe paving the way, but we still all exist in our small social world, you know, wherever we are geographically, in our family culture, friend culture, etc. And we maybe face the same challenge there. If we're going to be the first one to speak up about this stuff, what will the kind of the after effects of that be on us? Yeah. And I wish there was an easy answer of, oh, well, this is what you got to do. And then it will, here's how you deal with that. But it's really complicated, and each individual situation is probably unique and presents its own challenges. This is kind of leading into the next thing that I wanted to discuss a little bit related to this. And I'm trying to keep an eye on the clock too. So this gets at some of the things that Braden, Connor, and others have talked about as well, and Kevin Love shared also. Gender and emotion. We have some ideas about this as a society, about how emotions connect to different genders. And so I thought I would share some of the research with you that people are sometimes surprised by. I think that's one of the things I love about psychology. We're all humans, right? And so we all have an idea about what it means to be a human because we've lived it, right? I've been a human my whole life. I know how it is. Psychology as a scientific field allows us to take a little bit of a step back and to gain some data, to gather that, to ask some specific types of questions that can allow us to really get some insight that maybe when we're just reflecting on our own life, we wouldn't get. So one of the most surprising things related to gender and emotion, I call it a fun fact, you can call it whatever you want. Most studies, when we're looking at different genders, show no difference in the experience of emotion. And we can break down what emotion looks like. Often we break it down into the physiology of the emotion. So heart rate changes, et cetera, related to different emotions, brain activity, nervous system arousal, the expression of emotion. So what it looks like on our face and other nonverbal behaviors, and then the experience of the emotion. So what do I feel like as all these changes are happening related to anger or sadness? And when we look at the experience or the experience of the emotion and the physiology of the emotion, actually, I didn't put that up there, there's no difference across genders. Some studies actually show, surprisingly, that men have stronger experiences of certain emotion. Some show, you know, more nuances and different emotions. There are slight differences in experience. But if we collectively look at the studies, there really isn't strong evidence that gender is a relevant variable in predicting who is more or less emotional. Culturally, if you ask people, who's most emotional in terms of gender, what do you think the typical answer will be? Not that you yourself thinks this, but what would the average person off the street say? Women, yes. Emily says women. I don't know how to actually pronounce that. Do you say obvi? Let's just say that's what that is. Okay, so yeah, you know, people from all across the gender spectrum, on average, will say women are more emotional, almost as if it's settled fact. And it's really, really interesting to look at the actual studies where people are hooked up to heart rate monitors, skin conductance, other ways of measuring the physiology of emotion, and also self-report. How are you feeling? And they'll put it in an app or whatever. When we look at the actual data that we're gathering, there aren't gender-based differences. So this cultural idea we have that men are less emotional just isn't supported by the science. And what we do see is a difference in expression. There are very profound differences in terms of how emotions are expressed. So although we all are experiencing as humans the same emotions, I should say there are individual differences. Not all people experience the same intensity of emotions, but gender doesn't predict those. There are individual differences based on genetics, but again, gender doesn't predict those. So, but when we look at gender and emotional expression, what do people show? There are differences. If you had to guess, what emotions are men either encouraged to or discouraged from showing?
I think one of the more prevalent emotions that at least men are encouraged to show, whereas maybe women are discouraged, is anger or aggression.
Yes.
Those are often seen as not necessarily a good thing, but it proves your masculinity if you get angered or rile up. At least
Yeah. Anger is a strong emotion, right? I should put quotes around that. It's strong. It's okay to be angry. What else can men show? What else do we have available to us? If there's crickets right now, that might be because you've kind of covered it. We can be, men can be happy, but you don't want to be too happy, because that's a little bit weak also, right? You can be mildly happy, but you don't want to take it over the top. There are in terms of kind of the mainstream, obviously the United States is not a monoculture. There are lots of subcultures, but mainstream US society and some other Western cultures as well, men can be angry, men can be a little happy. A lot of other emotions, not so much. And this is really interesting. There's lots of studies that look at this. I thought I would show you one interesting example. So these faces here are, it's the same face. And it was designed to be a gender neutral appearing face. And they asked participants, what's the gender of this person? And when they had more angry or aggressive expressions, participants much more frequently said, that's a man. And when the expression was happier, participants much more frequently said, that's a woman. So even our perception of gender is related to these cultural ideas about what emotions are acceptable. And I just think that's so interesting. So as men, right, men are experiencing the same types of emotions as everyone, but there's a very limited range of what they're allowed to express while still being considered a good man, whatever that means. And so I have a few more questions for you, and maybe for the sake of time, we'll just discuss these as a group rather than in breakouts. We already talked about this one. I want to talk about these other two. So there are these off-limits emotions, emotions that are seen as being a little more vulnerable, like fear, sadness, shame, guilt, but also some of the positive ones like we talked about. They're kind of off limits in terms of expression. How does this affect men? And how does this affect all of us collectively as a society? What are your thoughts on those questions?
I guess since there's ones that are like off limits in like men's head, like they can't feel that. When they do feel that emotion, they feel like they're not a man, and they feel poorly about themselves, and they tend to shut down more.
Yeah. I mean, so imagine an example. This could be for, normal, healthy range of emotions, or for, emotions related to mental health issues as well. I mean, imagine somebody has depression or anxiety or something like that. Not only do I have depression or anxiety, but now on top of that, I also have guilt, shame that I am feeling these feelings of depression or anxiety. I'm not supposed to be. What is wrong with me that I'm feeling these things? And so that kind of adds a whole extra layer of suffering to men who not only experience mental health issues, but men who are just experiencing the normal range of human emotions. What are some other thoughts on this?
I think in terms of like how it might affect, society as a whole, with men and kind of that expressing anger being okay. I think unfortunately it continues to perpetuate violence, and men again, percentage wise, perpetrate violent acts, whether that's violence against women, other things at a higher rate. And I think, as a society, that has a huge impact.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm actually going to, on the next slide, I'm going to share some statistics related to that. But men who really strongly endorse these ideas that, yes, I think it's important to man up and whatever else we want to call that, they experience a greater prevalence of mental health issues, and also perpetrate violence against others at much, much higher rates. So there seems to be a pretty clear link between some of these socialized attitudes and mental health outcomes, and outcomes of people who are in men's lives, which is everybody, right? Everybody knows a man. And so this is kind of relevant for all of us. I think there might be some things in the chat. Let's see. Oh, okay. So Emily mentioned that perhaps because men are not taught as boys how to deal with and understand emotions, it's kind of left to other people who are in their circle to do some of that work for them throughout life. And so it's not just the man who's kind of bearing the cost of that, it's anyone who's in that man's life. And that could be, in the worst case scenarios, the man is kind of acting violently, and or it could be more subtle, that the people in their life have to help them with a lot of these things. All right, I want to share a few more things with you. There are some unique risk factors for men, and this connects really directly to what we were just talking about, that I wanted to share with you. There are lots of particular subgroups of men that we could point to who have higher rates of mental health issues. A few that really stand out in the literature: men who are gay and bi, and military veterans. They have higher rates of a variety of number disorders and very markedly higher rates of substance abuse issues. There are lots of reasons why this is the case, and because we're almost out of time, we have to kind of only touch on that briefly. I think I already mentioned this. Men are far less likely to reach out for help, either professional help or to friends. And this is something that is interesting as well. You see, starting at a young age, boys kind of policing their own friend group. You want to, if you see another boy kind of acting in a way that doesn't fit with this idea of what it is to be a man, that boy probably will get a negative response from their peer group. And so that leads to less sharing of these things and less help seeking. Men often downplay their symptoms for some of these same reasons. And then this kind of gets to what Emily commented on. Due to a history of invalidation when men show emotions, or as a boy you show emotions, the reaction to that is maybe just, well, I'm not going to do this anymore. So, imagine a boy, every time he cries, oh, you're fine, toughen up, like you'll be okay. Okay, I'm getting the message that I shouldn't share these things. And so as a result, I don't actually ever learn how to deal with this emotion. I just try to push it to the side and ignore it. And then I wanted to, how many of you, well, I don't know, it's hard to get a show of hands on here, but if you can do the little hand emoji or raise your hand, how many of you have heard of the man box before? I see a number of you raising your hand, and some not also. The man box is basically the name given to some of the things that we've been talking about, that there is a certain set of behaviors that are okay for you as a man and a whole lot that aren't. Some of these things would include, you can't show quote unquote weak emotions. You got to man up, toughen up. It leads to a lot of unhealthy behaviors, as we've discussed. So as I mentioned, scale was developed called the man box scale to measure this. And men who scored above a certain kind of range on that were twice as likely to experience depression and thoughts of suicide, and 5 times as likely to engage in bullying and sexual harassment and other forms of violence as well. So that is a pretty clear indicator that there's some kind of connection here, and good evidence that something should be done. And that's kind of where I want to end tonight, with a discussion of what we can actually do about this, because I think that's such an important conversation to have. And I understand we're getting close to 7, so if you've got to take off at some point, please do so without judgment. We'll wrap up pretty soon here after we discuss a few things. So I know we've talked about this a little bit, but I am curious to hear some examples, if any of you are willing to share any. In what ways does society teach boys and men to suppress emotions, to live in the man box? And if you've seen this happening to another man or boy, or if you've had it happen to yourself, I would love to hear examples of that. So again, no pressure, but you can either speak to this generally or more specifically, depending on your comfort level. And I see something in the chat here. Okay, so this is maybe relates to the discussion we were having as well, but a little bit ago, men potentially becoming on their partner, especially if it's an opposite sex partner, to kind of prop up their own well-being in a way, because perhaps they haven't learned some of these skills or how to have a healthy relationship with their own emotions in some ways. And I think that's an excellent point. It kind of speaks to what Emily had talked about as well. So what are other thoughts on this? How do men learn these things? What does society do?
It's hard to say what came first, but I mean, the fact that even there's a saying, man up, suggests that there's, I mean, I don't know when the first time I heard that saying was, probably elementary school, quite possibly before that. But the fact that that is even a saying when there's not really a saying that I'm aware of as woman up, it suggests that there's a behavior that you're expected to follow, and you've kind of been informed that from, I mean, earlier than I can remember.
And when you hear that, it means you're not doing it, right? So whatever you're doing right now, not good, not manlike. And I imagine most men have heard that at some point or another. I know I have. Can anybody think of other examples?
I guess in like movies and stuff like that, like children's movies, like the more like the punchline character or something like that, that's a man, typically shows like different emotions rather than being like brave or like, you know, strong. They're usually like, you know, either funny or like they're fearful, but they're portrayed in a way to make it seem like they're like, you know, they're pushed off to the side more, and everybody's expected to be like the other guy. Otherwise, they're like the punchline.
Yeah, so in film or TV or whatever, if a man is showing some other type of emotion, maybe sometimes they're shown almost as being a joke, or this is, hey, look at how funny this is that this dude is crying, or whatever the emotion might be, if they're afraid. Yeah, that's a great observation. I mean, let's see. Someone shared something in the chat that oh, interesting. So male and female twins, since entering school, the male child indicated that he can no longer like girl things, even though he has a desire to play with those things. And it's interesting that that happened in school, right? Most likely there's something happening there. I see this on the playground too. I try really hard not to judge parents because, wow, that's a hard job. But sometimes what you'll see, you know, a little girl falls down and the parent, or maybe the father, mother, whoever, right, picks the child up. Oh, are you okay, sweetie? If a boy falls down and is crying, oh, you're okay. You're okay. And just a very different response, even if it's like a 2-year-old, right? So from a really, really early age, it's not like these things are taught as explicit lessons, but in a lot of different ways they're communicated. So the last thing that I want to briefly discuss before we wrap for the night, what can we do about this? I think there's probably a conversation we need to have as a society on a large scale. And maybe there are also things that we can do in our own individual lives, whatever that looks like. What are some ideas that you have for what we can do on either of these levels to help reverse some of these things?
I think sometimes we get hung up when we hear things about like violence against women or mental health statistics, or particularly like violence in connection to male identity. I think that causes folks to kind of freeze up and not want to engage. But I think the larger picture is that these things are connecting and they're also harming male identified folks. And so I think as just like a basic step that we are also being harmed by not looking at these things and not addressing these pieces of this larger picture. Like not all men commit violence. However, we're all likely participating in these checks and balances of each other and not expressing vulnerability or even experiencing joy to the degree that we could.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. I love how you said, you kind of framed that, okay, there's a negative consequence of some of this stuff, like it's increasing our suffering, but also others in our lives, and also maybe preventing joy or flourishing, because I think we don't talk about that part as much. What would life look like if things were different? How much more satisfaction and connection might we experience if some of these things were different? Connor, I saw you maybe unmuting yourself. I'm not sure if that's true or not.
I was going to say that at least at a smaller scale, even if we can't change it for ourselves, we need to ensure that we at least start to ensure that other people aren't necessarily criticized the same way for wanting to express their emotions, especially with the next generation, because even if we can't change those who came before us, if we can make it better for those who come after, that's at least something that's progress as a society.
I love that. Yeah. Yeah. So looking at if we are in a parenting role or an educating role or some role where we have some kind of influence over the next generation, what can we do to instill different values to if we are male identified to be a different kind of man? Easier said than done. I had a conversation recently with my daughter. She's 5. And she was talking about, I don't even remember the context of it. All I remember is she said, well, daddies don't cry though. And I was like, what? Like, I cry, but I guess, that made me realize like, wow, I talk about this stuff all the time. And yet in my life, like my daughter has somehow formed this idea that daddy doesn't cry. I'm like, all right, I've got to like force some tears right now just to like make up for this. But it is easy to talk about it. And yet these things are sometimes so deep seated that it is really quite challenging in the moment to actually be different and do different. Other thoughts? I know that we're at time, and so we'll wrap soon, but I don't want to cut this off too prematurely either. One last thought that I guess just to kind of wrap it up a little bit. I was recently in conversation with a friend of mine, and he shared that during the early part of the pandemic, he had a major depressive episode. And even though he knows I'm a therapist, right? And I'm hopefully have conveyed openness to this. Despite all of that, I think he actually took a really big risk. And I remember one of my reactions in that moment was thinking how brave that was of him. And I didn't know if I would actually be able to do the same thing. And I tried in my response to him to be as supportive and non-judgmental as I absolutely could be, because I think it can start on an individual level like that as well. Talking with him, I think now, because he did that, I feel more able to share some of the things that I go through in my life with him. And it's kind of created a different dynamic in our friendship. I think paying attention for those little moments when we relate to the men in our lives, if they're being vulnerable, how are we responding? Are we kind of reinforcing the idea that that's not okay? Or are we providing them with that environment where they understand, you know, I can share these things with you and still be loved and respected and supported? I think that's a starting point. I definitely don't have all the answers, but I think that's something at minimum that all of us can do when the opportunity presents itself. For the sake of time and to respect all of your time, we can wrap it up here. If people do have other questions, I'm happy to hang back and we can, you know, chat a little bit more and after people leave, but absolutely no pressure to do that. Thank you again so much for spending an hour of your time here tonight. I value this so much and I appreciate that you're giving some of your time to it as well.